ca- casts Alex Haley's roots as a case study in the dynamic of scriptures and identity politics, with critical implications for the study of religion, race, and media. Kayla Renée Wheeler is an expert in contemporary Islam and Black material culture. She is an assistant professor of critical ethnic and Black studies and the Africana Studies program director at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. She is also the research director at the Center for the Study of Religion and the City at Morgan Study University. Dr. Wheeler is well known as a curator of the award-winning Black Islam syllabus. Currently, she is working on a book entitled Fashioning Black Islam, which provides a history of Black Muslim fashion in the United States from the 1930s to the present. Bryan Roby researches intersections of race, gender, and sexuality in Israel-Palestine and 19th and 20th century Jewish history in North Africa, in light of the contributions of his European colonialism and American political thought in these areas. He is an assistant professor of Judaic studies here at the University of Michigan. Roby's first book, The Mizrahi Era of Rebellion, Israel's Forgotten Civil Rights Struggle, 1948 through 1966, provides an extensive history of social justice protests by Middle Eastern Jews within Israel. His second book is what brings him to our talk today. In the second project, Dr. Roby explores how African-American intellectual contributions to Israeli sociology have shifted the boundaries of race constructs in Israel, and how the association of Middle Eastern Jews with Blackness can shed light on the symbolic power and composition of Blackness on a global scale. We will hear from our speakers in the order that I've introduced them. Questions can be entered into the chat at any time, and our discussant will present them to the speakers during the question and answer period for each talk. Thank you. I can't wait to hear this.
Well, thank you for that introduction. My talk this morning is entitled Myths That the Dark Past Has Taught Us, Reconsidering Liberation in the Academic Study of Religion. My late father is an alum of the University of Michigan, so it's a special joy for me to be with you today. And I think he would have enjoyed the theme and complexity that this series has been bringing to our attention on these matters that we hold so dear. He was a learned man, and while I don't recall him ever saying the word vernacular, though he surely knew it, I can't forget a story he told me about the time he heard Malcolm X speak at Michigan in 1963. Now, how much he actually heard is unclear to me, but I know he didn't hear as much as he would have liked. You see, while my father was at Michigan, he was part of the Air Force ROTC, and he was duly aware that he could not just be a student, but that he was likely being watched, as so many were who dared to entertain the message Malcolm presented. It's a disturbing irony that the university could ever be a place so closed to listening and critical inquiry. It's a part of our history, and I gather that many scholars in the study of religion see themselves as writing that history, though we have our work cut out for us. Unlike many fields in the university, the academic study of religion does not enjoy the privilege of coverage and pre-baccalaureate education. As teachers, we cannot assume that our most novice students have endured foundational courses or come to us having met some prerequisite in religious studies. Of course, one could take exception by citing the occasional secondary school comparative religions course, but I reckon that more often than not, this represents the exception that proves the rule. The idea that one can simply assume what religion is with the intellectual confidence to compare it would be otherwise embarrassing in almost any other field of study. The results of such a trial differ from, say, how physicists discuss weight or physicians germs. The contrast brings to mind the considerable preparatory discussions of what is and isn't meant so that those terms remain analytically significant. Teachers in these respective fields need not assume that students come to these subjects as blank slates, but regardless of the assumptions brought, students learn that scholarly use is predicated on a specificity that exceeds common usage. And for at least a dozen years, students develop a capacity to not only learn content, but to experiment with the terms on which they know what they know. The comparative religions course often does the opposite. It spends about a year using common sense and general observation as the bases for extrapolation. It adds data without considering the logics of observation. It incorporates more content without theorizing the parameters of categorical inclusion. So if an exceptional course exists in pre-baccalaureate education, I imagine that it is probably in the discussion of myth. Mythology is unencumbered by the valorization or battlement of literary canon. It is a tempered concept, treated with relatively considerable care, even at the elementary level. For despite myth's popular definition as untruth, students of the subject quickly learn myth to be a narration of a group's aesthetics, semantics, and ethical presuppositions. Myth, they learn, is the articulation of culture in story. And instead of measuring a people against a ruler of truth, students raise questions around the world in the text, as well as the worlds around and behind the text. Few places in the pre-baccalaureate curricula so sharply present the conditions for a scholarly consideration of the human. At the same time, however, I think professional scholars should be inordinately careful with how we read myths and the people narrating them. Otherwise, our scholarship itself will become a shibboleth instead of an analysis of them. The Ideology of Shibboleth is a helpful parable for thinking about myths as sites of social definition. In the biblical book of Judges, there's an episode in which two tribes, the Gileadites and the Ephraimites, are battling in the Jordan River Valley. And at one point, the Gileadites gain the upper hand, pushing the Ephraimites to turn home across the river. The Gileadites, however, have secured the river passage before the Ephraimites could attempt to cross. And the Ephraimites, we are told, will try their luck at passing themselves off as Gileadites. The question becomes, on what terms the Gileadites know their own? To determine this, the Gileadites create a cipher for sussing out friend from foe. All those wanting to cross the river would have to say the Hebrew word shibboleth, a word that points to an ear of grain crop or a waterway. And the Ephraimites and the Gileadites both spoke Hebrew. However, their respective dialects enunciate the word's first syllable differently. The Gileadite rendering includes an aspirated S as in shibboleth, whereas the Ephraimite sibboleth does not. And according to Judges 12:6, the Gileadites kill 42,000 Ephraimites in light of this cultural hermeneutic. In modern English usage, the very term shibboleth denotes a distinction of group belonging. What are the conditions under which something as innocuous as an accent can spell death? Where might we possibly trace cultural boundaries so clearly that they distinguish who should be able to live? The Gileadite story illustrates the finer implements humans devise to cut to the truth, like King Solomon calling for a sword to determine the woman to whom the baby belongs. Myth is a rhetorical flourish that extends the narrator the interpretive authority to stem complicated, if not unanswerable questions. It is a genre that shifts the discourse from explanations of why with elaborations of how. Thus, we are to marvel at the cunning of Gilead rather than consider the validity and casualties of ethnolinguistics. The wisdom of Solomon impresses, while we forget that the story centers around a mother who cannot get back her child and a mother who would do anything not to lose hers forever. Myths are enthralling tools for narrating the terms and conditions for when we can see ourselves as similar and different from others, making them powerful tools for furthering social formations, agendas, and, as Bruce Lincoln has pointed out, ideologies. So on the late modern precipice of neoliberalism, where corporations, the art and entertainment industry, and the academy want to know and want to include so many diverse stories and storytellers, shibboleths present us with an opportunity to examine the social dynamics these myths perpetuate. And this is where the educational programming of American children fails in regard to the study of myth. It does not speak about shibboleths, except when propped by so many statutes of limitations that they leave the status quo intact. There is quite literally no more fitting example than the refrain, "Jimmy crack corn and I don't care." In semantic terms, the famous line connotes apathy and detachment. The less acknowledged context is the indifference of a slave tasked with shooing flies away from his master and his master's horse. One day, the flies were so numerous that a stray fly bit the horse that bucked the master off to his subsequent death. "Old massa gone, now let him rest. They say all things and for the best. I never forget till the day I die. Old massa and that blue tail fly. Jim crack corn and I don't care." And on its own terms, the story could be read as a liberatory tale, and that understanding is premised on the same sort of interpretive license that makes it, like "Shoo fly, don't bother me," an innocent children's song. But it also begs a question for what kind of freedom can be sung about in the blackface minstrel tradition that made both of these songs popular. Just because an elementary discussion of mythology does not interrogate the rhetoric of liberation doesn't mean scholars of religion should avoid doing so either. Black meaning making is commonly signified by scholars as especially fixated or premised on liberation. And this makes a certain amount of sense given the prevalence of incarceration and castigation of Black peoples in the history of the US. But to rigidly equate the two is to accept the prescriptions of a cultural cipher and sociological scenario that ultimately limits the interpretive agency and diversity that Black people have historically exhibited, especially against the backdrop of white supremacy. It is to choose a necropolitics that can only account for the value of Black life in proximity to certain death, rather than to register the creativity and complexities otherwise taken to be the purview of human signification. If all Black folks can do is seek liberation, then they cease to exist once free. If the keys to their physical prison or psychic barracoons are held in bastions of whiteness, no matter how well-meaning or progressive, then their social reality can only be resolved with infantilizing divination, like eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger, buy a toe. And we would be wise to remember that the rhyme's earliest versions spoke not of tigers, but another quote unquote animal in the white imagination. Given how much racism pervades the traditions of early childhood education in the US, it is no wonder that a phrase like Black Power strikes many as immensely threatening. This is in part the struggle the Academy faces with rendering Blackness in the academic study of religion. Its students do not come to it with a blank slate, but a blackboard full of chalked myths in need of careful examination. Brothers James Weldon Johnson and John Rosamond Johnson's Lift Every Voice and Sing has been revisited regularly by scholars interested in considering the historiography and possibilities of Black religion. The Johnsons penned the song for a 1900 commemoration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. James Weldon Johnson drafted lyrics, his brother, the music. It was first sung by a Black children's school chorus in Jacksonville, Florida, but became a standard commonly referred to as the Negro National Anthem within 2 decades, and it is still known as such today.
Lift every voice and sing, till earth and heaven ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening sky. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
Late 20th century African-American biblical hermeneutics has had its mooring in its themes, this Negro National Anthem, that is, as evidenced by 3 major anthologies that have drawn inspiration from Johnson & Johnson's anthem. The 1991 volume, Stony the Road We Trod, African-American Biblical Interpretation, edited by Kay and Hope Felder, is a storied volume in its erudite melange of Black Bible scholars working out the paradoxes and tensions of the modern scriptural enterprise under racial duress. The 2003 volume, Yet with a Steady Beat, Afrocentric Biblical Interpretation, edited by Randall Bailey, represents a move from a broad and multifaceted interpretation of Bible reading and Blackness in the American context to an elaboration on African-American exegesis and its reception history. In the 2007 volume, True to Our Native Land, an African-American New Testament commentary with Brian K. Blunt at the editorial helm, expands on the tradition set forth by its predecessors with a confidence in the institution of African-American biblical studies. The latest of the post facto trilogy revels in the fullest articulation of the treatises presented. The focus unashamedly positions African-American biblical interpreters as authorities rather than aberrations in the history of the New Testament. To abbreviate this under the moniker of reception history is to miss a crucial element of the volume. Africans were in the Bible from the beginning. Many of the descendants of Africans enslaved in the New World came to use the Bible as a tool for working out and against the humanity to which they are being conditioned to accept. And ultimately, African-American interpreters have negotiated or arrived at an accommodated understanding of the New Testament. In all of this, we see an outline for a particular kind of liberatory African-American myth: the sojourn from hardship, the persistence through difficulty, and the arrival or complacency with an understanding of identity. In the turn to origins, a hermeneutical circle takes shape, the myth presenting a route for circumnavigation. Should one have the misfortune to be disoriented and find oneself within marinage, they can appeal to this myth to find guidance to an amenable circumstance. And it is that liberatory journey that for so many typifies a conceptualization of Black religion. But Islamic studies scholar Sherman Jackson has argued, even if Christianity has a tradition of exemplifying Black religion, it should not be taken as synonymous with it. The Christian hegemony that has prompted the occasion for Black people has not so determined those significations such that Christianity was the only response. In fact, Jackson theorizes Black religion as an undeclined language in contrast to the overdetermined social definitions of modernity. But he too holds the Johnsons to have effectively put voice to that notion. He says, Black religion, quote, has no theology and no orthodoxy. It has no institutionalized order and no public or private liturgy. It has no foundational documents or scriptures and no founding figures like Buddha or Zoroaster. The God of Black religion is neither specifically Jesus, Yahweh, nor Allah, but an abstract category into which any and all of these can be fit. Here's Johnson's line: the God of our weary years, the God of our silent tears, end quote. With those lyrics and Amiri Baraka's notion of Black people as blues people in mind, Jackson contends that for whatever appreciation for harmony and joy Black people may have, quote, Black religion remains in its abiding commitment to protest, resistance, and liberation, ultimately more committed to a refusal to be the object of another's will than it is to be a positive affirmation of any particular philosophy of life. Subversion, resistance, protest, opposition. These are all key to the constitution of Black religion. Charles Long concurs with Jackson insofar as the, quote, Afro-American religious experience is a counterpoint to Enlightenment assumptions of humanity. It should, quote, not be equated with Christianity or any other religion for that matter, Long says. It is replete with theologies opaque, evoked in a new beat, a new rhythm, a new movement, best expressed, Long says, in Johnson's poem. Elsewhere, Long summarizes the difficulty such it poses for the history of religion in general and the history of religion in the United States in particular. He says, it is therefore the religious consciousness of the Blacks in America, which is the repository of who they are, where they have been, and where they are going. A purely existential analysis cannot do justice to this religious experience. A new interpretation of American religion would come about if careful attention were given to the religious history of this strange American. Now, originally put forward in 1971, Long's perspectives for a study of Afro-American religion in the US has undoubtedly challenged the terms and conditions upon which American religion is conceived in the academy. At the same time, I'm not sure that the scholarship has formally followed Long's argument through to, or at least toward, its conclusion. An argument I think moves beyond theorizing religion qua religion and onto religion as an exemplar of myth-making. Even perspectives, which was later included in the 1986 Tour de Force set as significations, signs, symbols, and images in the interpretation of religion, draws on a wide array of examples that bestows no privilege on religions or the religious. The data there includes, but is not limited to, Brer Rabbit, High John the Conqueror, Black Muslims, Black Jews, the Moorish Science Temple of America, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Martin Delaney, Marcus Garvey, Herskovits-Fraser debate, Black liberation theology, Haitian voodoo, and other diasporic examples. The through line is in his focus on concretizing Black, or as he names Afro-American, experience for purposes of broader social observation and deeper cultural analysis. To this point, Long's later and though lesser engaged project, Alpha, Myths of Creation, suggests that he saw analytical possibilities in the critical examination of myth in monolithic terms, even within a subcategory or genre. But does an insistence on the centrality of liberation lead us into the waters of identificatory judgment, where the price for admission to wade comes with one's ability to say shibboleth properly? I cannot help but recall a televised 25th anniversary of Def Comedy Jam. Def Comedy Jam was a late night hip hop comedy showcase featuring Black humorists. And late into the celebration, comedians D.L. Hughley and Dave Chappelle, yes, that Dave Chappelle, broke from their teleprompter exchange for an extended aside to signify on what Def Jam represented in the broader American cultural landscape. They said, Chappelle said, if we told them what being Black in America is, would they believe us? This is not for TV, this is for us in the room. If we told them what being Black is in America, would they believe us? F no. There's a white supremacist starter kit at Target. And Chappelle goes on to send up a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the participants discount haircuts and presumably Target purchase tiki torches and khaki pants. And before returning to the teleprompter with a quoted passage and an excursus on comedy and the freedom of speech, Chappelle makes a joke at his own expense, centering a supposed lifelong struggle to read aloud. Hughley commiserates, adding that he has long hated reading and the educational cartoon Schoolhouse Rock. Chappelle counters that he loves Schoolhouse Rock and that its catchy musical numbers on government operations are the reason he can make sense of current events in the news. Hughley and Chappelle join in singing the line, "I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill," with the audience laughing in their corporate familiarity with the song. Hughley interrupts to say that Black people know the words to that song better than they do the Black national anthem, that is James Weldon Johnson's lyrics. Chappelle further signifies Hughley's punchline by leading the audience in a rendition of the song's first verse. Chappelle knows every word to Johnson's anthem while the camera pans the room, and the video confirms what can be heard. Black people's familiarities with the song is mixed. Some sing boldly, confidently, others do their best, dropping in and out like Hughley, playing off their own discomfort, and others, including some of the non-Black audience, are quiet in their disconnection. Whether one learns the words at home, at church, or at school, or in one's own study, memorization of lift every voice and sing, including customary rhythms and harmonies, reflects a kind of cultural commitment to be demonstrated on command, whether scheduled or impromptu. In fact, knowing its titular verse, and even more so its subsequent two verses, by heart, can be a sort of shibboleth of a Black identity, shaped by a specifically rooted political consciousness, one steeped in the struggle of liberation. But as a scholar of Black religion and social theorist, I think we must also ask if there are not other myths that the dark past has taught us, ones that exude as millennial Renaissance man Donald Glover sought to prove with his show Atlanta, that quote, white people don't know everything about Black culture. Undoubtedly, the field has begun the work of deconstructing the master's house, but in the excavation of the master's habitus, it has only scratched the surface of a project that is more than skin deep. The problem with focusing solely on liberation in the academic study of religion is that it can only redescribe myths that depend on the erection and dismantling of prisons. But even when it examines the harrowing social dungeons that bind us from the inside out, it will struggle to fathom the dark sorcery with which Black people have sought to conjure meaning in spite of modernist and Enlightenment paradigms. Thus, I'm not surprised to see the Johnson's hymn inspire historiographic readings of Black religion that have focused less on liberation per se, and more on transgression and transcendence of categorical definition. Von Booker's Lift Every Voice and Swing, Black musicians and religious culture in the jazz century, portrays many of the jazz greats as riffing and modulating the standards of Black Protestant social movements, 20th century conceptions of Africa, and racialized assumptions about Black people in the US. Alicia Lola Jones' NPR article, Lift Every Voice, Marian Anderson, Florence B. Price, and the Sound of Black Sisterhood, sounds clearly the need for, quote, inter and intracultural analysis when examining the performance of identity. We're one to take a shibboleth mentality to the internationally acclaimed Black musicians Jones studies, we would lose sight of how these Black women understood themselves, free to reject the premises put before them, and how they sung their song. Likewise, asking whether a myth is more indicative of Black resistance or the politics of American accommodation fails to consider what Eddie Glaude terms, quote, the politics of transvaluation, the reconsideration of the extent to which a celebration of Blackness is conducive to the preservation and enhancement of Black individuals and communities through the US. One group's liberative myth is another castigation, but comparison positions us to explore how the phenomena of Blackness is not necessarily more deliberation, and even when it is, it's not necessarily done so in the same ways. Beyond the biblical stories and hermeneutics noted thus far, Naisha Jr. has documented the counterintuitive ways that Hagar, the Egyptian woman who was wife and slave of Abraham, mother of the child Ishmael, becomes identified with, by, and as Blackness. At the same time, Jr. definitely shows that the idea of Hagar as a Black woman is a most belated one, and that 19th century imaginings of Hagar as a Black woman were present in pro-slavery and anti-slavery arguments alike. Wendy Doniger calls this the multivocality of their myth-making. To situate this observation in light of Johnson & Johnson's anthem, the dark past has taught us that myths contain multitudes of significatory possibilities, and our task should not insist otherwise. We need an analytical model of myth that prepares us to recognize how narratives go against typecasting, how their analogics make use of perception and deception of others, how they distract us from questions of why with answers of how, and how when juxtaposed, their similarities still belie permutations of difference. One way Doniger prepares us to do so is through her deconstruction of myth into two types of metamyths. That is, myths comprised of micromyths, the neutral structures or signs or symbols with which myths are composed, and there are macromyths, or the political construction where all interpretive possibilities are sublimated into a comprehensive program, narrative, or identity. Examining both helps us appreciate motifs and archetypes, as well as story arcs and ideologies without imposing any particular intrinsic relationship between them. I think this would expand our analytical capacity to notice myths in Black religion, not easily redescribed as liberatory. For example, Long initially conceived the study of Black religion as interested in a matrix of, quote, symbolic images and methodological principles. There was Africa as historical reality and religious image. There was the involuntary presence of the Black community in America. And there was the experience and symbol of God and the religious experience of Blacks. While I think this is immensely helpful for historicizing many of the significations and myths of Black people in the US, it also seems to delimit Black religion within the chaos of the racial project and the cosmos of liberation from it. So what if we were to disaggregate this into metamythic components? Africa, America, God would be the operative micromyths, and the macromyths would be the historical reality and religious image, the involuntary presence and the religious experience of Black peoples. I suspect that this would hinder appeals to methodological shibboleths, what Stephen Ramey has called playing accidental favorites. And even more so, I think it would challenge us to appreciate more of the myths that the dark past has taught us and what significance religion has in each historical instance. Toward this aim, Judith Weisenfeld begins her majestic New World of Coming with an insightful account of the early 20th century journalist and history writer, Joel Augustus Rogers. She describes his legacy in Black religion in a passage worthy of being read in full. Popular historians of the period also helped to open up the intellectual space for Blacks in the US to think in unconventional ways about narratives of peoplehood, religious history, and racial identity. Jamaican-born Joel Augustus Rogers, who immigrated to the US in 1906, was an influential figure in this regard, with books like From Superman to Man, in which he attacked racial hierarchy and notions of white superiority, and the many editions of the pamphlet 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro with Complete Proof, a shortcut to the world history of the Negro. Rogers also wrote for the Black press, most notably a regular column on Your History in the Pittsburgh Courier. He offered his readers an ambitious global history, highlighting the cultural and political contributions of people of African descent across time, while also arguing that the ubiquity of racial intermixing throughout history made it impossible to speak of pure races. Religion was not Rogers' main focus, but he often addressed religious development in his global histories of race, encouraging readers to situate biblical narratives in a longer historical scope and insisting that our moral heritage derives from a wider human past enormously older than the Hebrews. Rogers' emphatic message that Black history predates enslavement in the New World resonated powerfully with the kinds of narratives members of the religio-racial movements embraced. It's a very fascinating case study in the way vernaculars work. And I've thought a lot about Rogers' contribution to Black religion since a visit home about 10 years ago. My mother presented me with a Black book of newspaper clippings, its pages deteriorating from age and the pulp's acid. There were upwards of 86 pages of Rogers' facts about the Negro collected in that book. Each page was a triptych of Black history in a comic style imitating Ripley's Believe It or Not. A late uncle of mine had collected these over the years, and when he died, they were left to my octogenarian grandmother. As she tried to push away the pull of dementia, she grabbed onto this loose leaf assemblage of things, quote, old like her, as she wrote in the margins of one page. Now, for someone who lived through the majority of the 20th century and lived with stories from family who survived through the 19th, I've wondered how she put together the pieces in her mind. What did she learn and teach from the raw material of myths presented in Rogers' work? Certainly stories of liberation abound, but what other stories could there be? I've begun to work through this using digital concordance tools, discourse analysis, and the model I described previously. And I'll just summarize some of my preliminary findings and hope that they broaden our horizon for theorizing mythologies, vernacular and otherwise. Readers of our day may be caught off guard by Rogers' encyclopedic knowledge of what we often describe as Africana history. He understood Africa as a conceptual space to exist beyond the frames of diaspora and continent. The Black Atlantic is an important formation for him. This is as evident in his read of General Boudot as the Toussaint L'Ouverture of the Virgin Islands, as it is in his viewing of The Love Slave or Esclave d'Amour as a portrait of Algerian beauty held captive in Paris's Luxembourg Museum. Rogers is famous for seeing Africa not only as a site of origins, but as originating a world diaspora. Africa was the oldest of places, its peoples on nearly every continent, their influence ubiquitous. Today's Africana scholars have critiqued his impulse for exaggeration, but I think it plays an important part in conveying his enthusiasm for what we call today the Black globality, as well as the way 20th century Africans like Nigerian Dr. Samuel L. Manua were helping to dream new political destinies on the continent and beyond. This is an important rejoinder to the proliferation of the myth of American exceptionalism. As an immigrant, Rogers was subject to the racist lessons of this teaching. That animated much of his reading and rendering of the US. It was, that is, America was, but one revolutionary state. And furthermore to him, America and other New World projects were utterly dependent on Black peoples. Many of its exemplars, like naturalist John Audubon and the infamous and now famous Alexander Hamilton, according to Rogers, were not so secretly colored. This didn't exempt either from their participation in the horrors of slavery, but it did show America's sordid complexity, especially in comparison to the Black genius that he historicized as often as he could. If from Superman to man put white supremacy in question, facts about the Negro made Black excellence a declaration. Whether in its account of the Ugandan scribe Ham Mukasa's famed translation of Christian texts in the early 20th century, or Rogers' theory that the historical Buddha was indeed a Negro, the US was in no way, shape, or form the center of the universe. I think this decentering of traditional power dynamics also extends to his significations of God. And this is perhaps where I qualify a bit of Weisenfeld's interpretation, though I maintain that it fits the analysis she's advancing. I don't see Rogers as uninterested in religion, but he is a thorough relativist. Black people strive and thrive wherever they find themselves, he says. Thus, creedal affirmation to institutions and deities are often incidental. Black people at times, like the Jamaican woman using a, quote, African remedy to heal the British hero Lord Nelson, can appear to be working against their own political interests. But for Rogers, even these tales help to convey that Black people have a history of being prophets, priests, and in the case of the Olmecs, even gods. And why not? Even elementary students know that as much and more is to be expected in myths. but the study of Black myths are too often limited to frames of liberation. And we should begin to wonder whether our well-meaning attempts to diversify research agendas and syllabi in department faculties involve a shibboleth clause, only allowing inclusion of those conceived of as dying to be free, not the ones who rejected the premise of bondage in the first place. Attention to vernaculars keep the politics of this on our mind, but the dark past has taught us that people cannot be held to one story, and we should free ourselves to learn the other verses they voice and sing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Newton. I'm not sure if Rebecca's going to kind of field things, but at the moment, what we're going to do is kind of leave it open for questions and answers. I'll give the audience a few minutes. I have a couple of questions of my own, or just points of clarity. Particularly, I'm intrigued by this notion of like the ontology of Blackness being centered around liberation is problematic. Given that, I guess, once you're liberated, then Blackness no longer exists. Is that correct? Like, I'm just trying to get that straight there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a level at which one can see why it would make sense to define the ontology of Blackness as, sort of definitively liberatory. But the premise of a need to do so assumes a certain Enlightenment and modern ideal that defined Blackness otherwise, with a very different ontology. Not even that Black people were, that white people were superhuman or Superman, but that Black people weren't human at all. And I think by, the notion that we should stay with an argument of liberation is one that certainly, like, to stay with it, I think, is to return back to the sort of modern premises by which the human making that put us in this situation in the first place is defined. I wonder and I question and I'm suspicious of frameworks that require liberation to be the sole story for Black people. Like, why can't we imagine? Why is it so difficult to imagine that Black people could be far more creative than sticking to one story? We know how creative Black people are. We've historicized it, we've exoticized it. But in terms of who they are, it so frequently seems that it's defined by liberation. And I think that's something that, to me, at least for scholarly analysis, harkens too much to a past that we thought we have deconstructed. But perhaps we're just continuing to build it more and more in maybe more subtle and nuanced ways, but ways that can be dangerous nevertheless.
Yeah, thanks. So I do want to remind the audience, feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat, and I'll read through them. I see we have one. I have two more kind of questions. I would say, like, what you were saying reminds me of like Baldwin, in a sense, when he talks about whiteness, right? Why do you need the Black man in order to exist, right? For white America, in that sense. And it kind of sounds like, having that ontology of Blackness centered around liberation makes it so that Blackness needs whiteness in order to exist, or Black people need whiteness in order to exist. This kind of like parasitic symbiotic relationship in some ways. Yeah.
And right, that whiteness, as Baldwin understood it, was not just phenotype, but the way in which you have a regime in which the comfort and convenience of one group of people is held over the dignity and security of another, right? And I think that sort of liberation continues to narrate a story in which people are questioning, well, how secure and free are they? If you have to ask, are you really free? And I'm not saying that liberation is bad. I mean, that, in fact, that's not my point at all. Rather, if we are only attuned to studying and observing liberation and expecting that from Black people, not looking at other possibilities for the way they tell their stories, then we've typecast them. And we've probably built a new sort of structure that positions them to prop up other things like that we know of, like whiteness, like religious hegemonies, like so many other sort of isms and ideologies that are worthy of more careful examination.
Yeah, thank you. My other question is concerning that 100 amazing facts about the Negro. That is like really striking. One in particular because of the kind of comic book design with the triptych. But then also I noticed that, you know, this love slave that was pictured featured, you know, it looked like it was based around Etienne Dinet's work, right?
Absolutely, yep.
Which is just like, wow, what, you know, in some ways, because he's this, you know, French Orientalist painter who then, you know, converts to Islam and, you know, but still has these like somewhat problematic, you know, Orientalist notions about the Arab or the, you know, the African other, particularly North Africa. So I'm wondering, is there kind of some connection in terms of Black Orientalism, or at least Black American Orientalist notions? Are they in conversation with each other, or was it just like, oh, well, this is African and I read this thing about it, so that's why I'm putting this in the
well, I think, I mean, your historicizing of it is, I think, spot on and very much what Rogers gets excited about, I think. And I interpret Rogers as seeing all these sorts of significations as, you know, fair in the game. Like if he sees it as an example of Black humanity, good, bad, and ugly, in fact, in his narration of it, it is all in a context that will ultimately exemplify Black humanity, Black excellence, Black genius, and Black ubiquity in a way that confounds the simplistic white notions that have been put forth on Black people. And I think this is important for Rogers insofar as he's coming from one register of race and class in Jamaica to a different one in the United States, and is trying to make sense of how multiple rubrics of race exist in the world, but also seeing a commonality about how it plays out on Black bodies, and in Black histories, and in Black myths and stories and texts, and also in white text and stories and myths and songs. And so he's, you know, I think he is authorizing himself to be able to connect the dots in whatever way he wants to depict the images he thinks are more befitting of Black people. And sure, there are contours of which that we would find unsavory for sure, whether they're Orientalist or just historically suspect, but that's not his game, right? Like just like I don't think he's trying to be particularly religious. I think he's religious insofar as he finds religion an important discourse to engage. You know, if it shows Black people as the tellers of their own stories and as active participants in the construction of the world, then he can make do with it, and invites others to do so as well.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience. I'm just going to read it out loud. How do you understand Weisenfeld's argument regarding the efforts to reconceptualize and even reject Blackness in the alternative religions that she discusses? Actually, that's very much related to my question too, so go for it.
Yeah, I think, well, I think that's for Rogers an important point, right? Because he understood his identity on terms that would jive with notions of Blackness, but also other terms as well. And I think Weisenfeld's idea that people are trying to come to terms with identity formation by whatever means necessary, using and playing against and collating lots of different domains of discourse to do so, even away from and apart from Blackness, I think is something that we need to include in the mythologies that we associate with Black people. I think that the idea that Black people have always been interested and invested in Blackness and held Blackness sacrosanct is just simply not historically true. But we should ask why and how and when and where in these conditions that I think her work gets us doing by bringing all these people into a sort of new history of Black religion. I mean, as much as many of these groups see themselves as not Black, want to define themselves as otherwise, they also do so in a context in which other people are reading them as Black. And so the multivocality that is happening there, what Alicia Lola Jones calls the intercultural sort of themes, are as important as the intracultural themes. And we need a study of mythology that can do both.
I see. So, I mean, in this case, it kind of sounds like, there's this kind of reconceptualization of Black religion as universal, but also not tied to any particular kind of Abrahamic religion in that sense. Particularly when we were talking about, it's not, whether you're talking about God, Allah, or, Judaism, Islam, and things like that. So I'm wondering, what does that do for us, kind of separating Blackness from any particular religion, a religious tradition in that sense, and kind of seeing it as something that's, ubiquitous in some ways, but then also very much connected to each other?
So for me, in my kind of larger project, the way I've been approaching it is by thinking about the way that religion is a discourse that Black people had to learn in the New World by penalty of death, right? Like that they didn't come here with religion per se, at least in the eyes of the people that took them and brought them and sold them necessarily, but they better learn how they relate to this thing being called religion, right? There's a spiritual, Michael Brandon McCormick at Louisville, he did a great teaching tactic about this in Pan-African studies. He starts his religious studies classes off looking at this spiritual where, the lyrics are, I've been buked and I've been scorned. And it's sort of the first verse ends with, but ain't gonna lay my religion down. Like, why is it that this discourse that we know has dealt death and put people in prison and brought shame on people is also something that we can't afford to lay down or ignore or avoid? And I think the history of religion, as far as I'm concerned, takes that and looks at, well, what are people up to here? How do we watch people signifying in such a way that they can make religion do all this kind of work, and that we can make it work for ourselves too? And then once we do that, we can begin to ask ourselves, where have we seen this before? I think Charles Long does this as well. So he's going to talk about Garvey. He's going to talk about these case studies that are not traditionally understood as religious, because he's interested in how human beings signify the world around them, how they see the world as full of potential signs to be signified by signifiers. But some people can do it more than others, right? Some people get to say how things are and what time it is more than other people do. And I want to look at what are the terms and conditions by how this works. And religion gives us tons of case studies in that, but it points us and orients us to ask, where else have we seen this story play out before? And I want to say that Black people have responded, not with just songs of liberation, but with a whole host of other things that make us forget that they were ever imprisoned in the first place, and help us remember that their story didn't begin with enslavement either. So that's the kind of approach that I think looking at a sort of wider swath of data challenges us to look at. Not to say let's ignore religion, but rather to think about what religion can point us to in making sense of people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm really, I enjoy kind of like this idea of like kind of a sonic history of like Black religious traditions in some ways, particularly regarding like, some of the ambiguities within spiritual lyrics, right? Whereas, it can fit with multiple different religious traditions or multiple religions, lines, I can't think of anything in particular, but, things that refer to like, the Lord, that could work for anyone.
I heard a Muslim woman talk about how in Johnson's lyrics about turning to the sun, for her, in her journey, in her story, she understood that as an orientation for a call to prayer. And that she believed that it actually speaks to a deeper history of Black Muslims in the United States, maintaining a knowledge and orientation that is much older and much significant than even the Johnsons remember. She was dropping that knowledge and I was like, okay.
I'm here for it.
Like, that's the kind of myth making, right? Not untruth, but dropping truth, right? That I think we are free to consider and examine critically if we don't bind ourselves simply to liberation and the myths that are deemed acceptable in so many of the spaces that we get to talk about human beings.
Great, wonderful. I see okay, now there's a comment here. Just give me a minute here. So read through this. Yes, there's a reference to Shaft there, about you ain't so black. And then Shaft saying, white coffee cup, you ain't so white, baby. That's an interesting thing to point out. So now we have another question. They thank you for this fascinating lecture. I'll start with that one. This person would like to hear more about how you see the implications for looking beyond liberation and religious studies more broadly. Not entirely sure of the entire context of that, but I'll let you kind of interpret that as you see it.
Well, I think for one, said that Charles Long, who I draw upon quite a bit here, was one to bring, especially in a sort of intracultural setting or an intra sort of like among scholars who are interested in Black religions. He had no problem raising the observation that many of the people we see as the victims of history have also, if we remember them, if we care about them, they are connected to histories of violence as well, like the doing of violence. Like he has pushed back against the idea of the sort of blameless indigenous peoples. Not because he thinks indigenous people are sort of inherently evil, like that there's some ontology of wickedness there, but rather, if they are human and we know how history plays out, we should ask ourselves whose stories aren't being told and why are we only remembering or paying attention to these other stories? And I think a similar thing happens when we move beyond liberation as being the sole story for Black people. I think we are able to begin to tell stories about Black people or redescribe Black humanity in ways that are not easy fits, whether it's in white histories or even the convenient Black histories that we need to tell, within a community to keep going. Mm-hmm. I think, and this is my whole thing about the academic study of religion. This is for me. I wouldn't put this on anyone else, but I would never say that I think that my scholarship is going to help make the world a better place. What I do hope is that I keep it real and stop, if not others, definitely myself, from being able to say, well, I just didn't know. I just wasn't aware. That sort of idea that, I was just acting out of ignorance. No, I think scholarship can put people on notice that we are capable of all sorts of things, power dynamics that we learn to tell as stories that are A-okay, that are like all those children's stories or all those children's songs I started talking about at the very beginning, right? You can't get through an American elementary school without learning these minstrel songs, and I hope we can begin to unpack that. If we're going to talk about mythology in school with kids, I hope we can unpack the mythologies we keep peddling as truths and histories. Not that the others weren't truths in the first place either, but rather that there's a politics there. There's a game there. Wittgenstein says a language game that says some are more equal than others. And I want to work through that, but we got to be more attuned to the multi-vocality of the stories we tell ourselves to get a good sleep at night and keep going.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have 1 minute left. I'll just make a little comment about some of the things that were going on in the chat and say that I was kind of surprised that a few of the attendees did actually learn Lift Every Voice and Sing in school. I did as well, and I know it by heart. And one thing would be, I was kind of surprised by how different that version that you played was from what I know it as, in terms of the genre.
I know.
Yeah, I was just wow, what is this?
Can I say that I found myself as I was going through YouTube trying to find a video that I can embed. I was like, look, let me find a video that does it right. That hits the Lift Every Voice and Sing is in a lot of like white mainline Protestant hymnals now, right?
Oh.
Like this is worth knowing, and perhaps the point to all of this, we might say, right? What does it mean that, you know, these churches that had literally split because they didn't want Black people in it, or from their get-go were like, no, you can't do this, like go start your own thing, are like, no, actually we're going to sing this, we have this in our hymnal, and we'll bring it out, you know, once a year, usually MLK Sunday or something. And then they do it in a way that, like this one, you're like, oh, is that how we do? I don't think that's how we do this. There's like the sort of hidden transcript there that they weren't hip to. I was trying to find one that I thought did it right, but then I kind of saw myself as also putting down sort of a shibboleth. I mean, here are some Black singers who are doing this song and using their considerable training to express something. And I didn't want to be, I thought maybe it's better that I put forward that to confound our ideas of how our myths are supposed to be, and rather focus on how we tell the myths with so many layers and tools. Because as much as we say we all know how it's supposed to be done, like there's one way to do it, we know that there's a certain amount of variety that if you pull it off, it's amazing. And if you mess it up, you're out.
Yeah.
And I think it's within there that all sorts of human significations happen. And I want to know, on what terms do people judge such things? And so I thought that would be an interesting inclusion. There were some that were just perhaps unequivocally bad that I was like, nope, can't show that. That's not going to work. But this one I felt like highlighted the complexities of sort of Black artistic expression, and how all human beings work within the frameworks they find themselves, the context that they are present in.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're now going to move on to Dr. Wheeler. I believe Rebecca will be introducing Dr. Wheeler. That is.
We did all introductions at once, so we're ready to go for the lecture. I
Oh,
can't
we
wait.
did. Oh, I see. Okay. Whoops.
See how much you listen to me. That's okay.
So please, yeah, Dr. Wheeler.
Awesome. 1 second. All right, so thank you so much to Dr. Wallenberg and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies for having me today. I want to start off with acknowledging that today is Indigenous Peoples Day. My university sits on unceded Shawnee and Mia land, and was founded by a Jesuit slaveholder who had to sell his enslaved people to a Kentucky Jesuit institution to take over the university. So if you can, I encourage you to donate to a fundraiser or an organization led by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, like the Federal Court Legal Fund for Freedmen Descendants or the Red Nation. So my talk today is based on some new research and very, very exploratory research that I'm doing for what will hopefully turn into my second book project, and was partly inspired by a tweet that went viral in mid-September. So it comes from user Nordic Carrie, and she posted a picture of a rack of Prairie dresses, the latest fall arrivals at Target, with the caption, "Am I the only one who is completely weirded out by this trend in clothing?" Many users pointed out that the designers were inspired by 1970s peasant dresses trends, or the more recent cottagecore trend, which emerged on Twitter in the early 2010s as a form of nostalgia for rural domesticity that emphasizes homemaking, gardening, upcycling, and sewing. Cottagecore reached a new level of popularity in 2020 when much of the world went on lockdown. However, a small number of users took issue with the clothing, not only calling it ugly or frumpy, but also a reflection of the attack on reproductive rights underway across the country. So users referenced the Texas anti-abortion laws, the Hulu television show and book, A Handmaid's Tale. Others pointed out that it looked like Christian groups like Mormons, Mennonites, and Amish. And so these are just some of those tweets. These critics position modest dress as unfashionable and reserved for conservative religious women. For them, the Prairie dress was not a reflection of fashion recycling every 20 years, or that these kind of dresses are a lot more comfortable than bodycon dresses and skinny jeans. Rather, it was a symbol of patriarchal oppression marked by restrictions on reproductive health, domesticity, and polygamy. While I'm used to such statements being made about covert Muslim women, who are the primary group I study, and when people talk about Muslim women in the media, their clothed bodies are often positioned as a sites for literally a clash of civilizations, where hijabs and khimars are viewed as anti-modern and anti-fashion. But I was actually somewhat surprised to see the same language used to describe conservative Christian women's dress, seeing how very, very Christian this nation is. What was largely missing from the conversation were Jewish, Muslim, and Christian women's voices who are committed to modest dress. While not directly responsible for the rise of cottagecore or the return of 1970s flower power aesthetics in the mainstream fashion industry, these women have been developing similar styles for the past 20 years through thrifting, sewing, and various layering techniques, and slowly influencing mainstream fashion trends. So you might remember a few years ago when long denim skirts came back. That was certainly an influence of modest religious women. Much of these innovations have been documented online in the form of fashion blogs, lookbooks, and on social networking sites like YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Yet, women, a part of the 3 largest Abrahamic religions, have often been left out of conversations about fashion. And I argue that's for 2 main reasons. First, many people view religion and fashion as incompatible. If fashion is liberating and secular, then religion is anti-modern and oppressive to women. Second, the US public has a habit of ignoring the influence of non-Christian religions on our popular culture. But by ignoring these women's voices, we are missing an important part of American fashion history, which has always been influenced by religion and religious people. So Jewish, Muslim, and conservative Christian women committed to modest dress were some of the early innovators on online shopping, filling the gaps within mainstream stores, which often ignored their sartorial needs. Whereas prior to the introduction of social media and blogging and online shopping, modest women often bought their clothes from small local boutiques owned by their co-religionists or from mail order catalogs. Still, others had to rely either on various layering techniques or their own sewing skills, which drastically limited their clothing options. The emergence of online shopping and social networking sites provided them with an array of different clothing options, usually at a very reasonable price. And so this was especially important for women who did not live in large religious communities. So since the 1990s, different religious women have been using the internet to create community with each other. Started off with kind of like digital enclaves where Jewish women were primarily talking to Jewish women, Muslim women talking to Muslim women, and Christian women talking to Christian women. But as Renée Lewis points out, the deterritorialized nature of the internet allows for new communities to form around common interests that might not otherwise interact online. So in the past 10 years, there's been a shift where women are not only talking to their co-religionists, but they're also trying to build space for interfaith dialogue with other women who are interested in modest dress. They come together to deliberate on definitions of modesty, share styling tips, and help other women to see modesty as both beautiful and fashionable. And these kind of conversations that are happening online are trickling into everyday life, including in the Target clothing aisles. So in this presentation, I want to talk more about modest fashion and how Muslims, Christians, and Jewish women have come together to have these interfaith discussions. So first, I'm going to highlight how these women construct modesty through conducting a critical discourse analysis of YouTube videos and comments centered around religious modest dress. While leaving room for distinct religious interpretations, these women have constructed universal understandings of the goals of modesty while honoring that it is practiced differently across religion, race, ethnicity, and age. After that, I'm going to discuss how online clothing stores have responded to these interfaith discussions on YouTube and other social media sites by looking at 3 popular e-stores that specialize in modest clothing. What I've found is that distinct fashion spheres like Muslim fashion, Jewish fashion, and Christian fashion still exist, but they are joined by a growing sphere known as modest fashion, which unites women of Abrahamic religions with other women interested in dressing modestly yet fashionably. Finally, I will discuss the limitations of using fashion as a venue for interfaith dialogue among women of Abrahamic religions from a Muslim woman's perspective. So many women engage in interfaith dialogue in modest dress spaces do so by focusing on the commonalities across different religious groups, which can lead them to flattening their distinctiveness. So I chose to focus on 6 YouTubers that represent the racial and ethnic diversity of the religions to analyze their videos to show how this dialogue takes place, primarily in their comment sections, but also within the videos themselves. So the first is Andrea Greenberg, who is the founder and owner of Rapunzel. The second is Mayora Hamier, the founder of House of Judah, a Jewish streetwear store. The third is Melanie L. Turk of Hope Hijab. The fourth is Nadir Abdulqudus, who founded 037 Collection. Next is Michelle Cart, a burgeoning Christian modest fashion blogger. And the final is Alethea Olar of Gotcha Covered Fashion, a very popular conservative Christian blog. So the typical YouTube blogger is young, educated, middle class, thin, able-bodied, and conventionally beautiful. For many of these women, there's a clear trajectory for them with their blogging. They pick up a niche area to develop. So in this case, primarily fashion, either clothing or headscarf videos. They build a strong viewership base, and then they're able to launch an online business. So that was the case for Andrea Greenberg and Nadir Abdulqudus. Melanie L. Turk had her small business, Hope Hijab, when she first started, but was able to use YouTube to help build it up. So the most successful bloggers can go mainstream and interact with the broader mainstream fashion industry. And that's certainly been the case with Melanie L. Turk, who's been able to influence how mainstream fashion brands communicate what modesty is to their audience. So these bloggers are creating a business and they are selling the idea of modesty to their viewers. Part of marketing this involves selling an unattainable dream, the camera ready-made modest fashionista who always has fresh, up-to-date clothes and time to spare. They're selling the idea that modesty is cool to their viewers by providing them with a practical guide on where to buy clothing, how to modify it to fit their individual definitions of modesty, and how to style clothing fashionably. So fashion bloggers are doing more than just talking about clothing. They talk about their mundane lives to build a sense of affinity with their viewers, share their own struggles with deciding to dress modestly, and provide religious education. I argue that social networking sites like YouTube provide a space for religious women to develop new religious interpretations and flex their own religious authority without necessarily usurping the authority of male leaders. Modest fashion bloggers frequently point out in their videos that they are providing their own opinions based on their readings of religious texts, which people are free to agree with or challenge, rather than a legal ruling or binding religious edict. These bloggers are still making religious statements, however, because they are clearly marking some practices as permissible or forbidden while allowing for room for dialogue and dissent. The vloggers are not seeking to dismantle the current power structures. They're just trying to have a bigger stake in it. And the comment section provides a space for viewers to sometimes challenge what the vloggers are saying, as well as communicate their own interpretations. So there are several commonalities in terms of messaging around modestly dressing among these vloggers. Many of them focus on the multiple meanings of modesty. So it's not just dress, but it's also thoughts, behaviors, and general comportment, which Mayora Hamier notes in her video on CNews. Another common strategy for bloggers is to talk about the many benefits of dressing modestly, like making them identifiable as a part of a religious group or helping them feel closer to God. Alethea Olar posted a popular video entitled 4 Benefits of Dressing Modestly in October 2019. And her 4 listed were: first, modest clothing is more comfortable because it's looser and therefore easier to move around in. Second, modest dress wearers do not have to worry about dress codes at school or work because they're always going to be more conservative than anyone else. The third is modest dress can help improve self-confidence because the focus is not on your body, but on your inner beauty and personality. And finally, modest dress is timeless. So you save money because you're not necessarily following trends. Interestingly, while Althea is a Christian, none of her examples were overtly religious. In fact, she explains at the beginning of her video that being forced to wear modest dress by her conservative Christian parents made her dislike dressing modestly. She also believes that women who dress modestly, she also rejects the belief that women who dress modestly have more self-respect for themselves or that their clothes prevent them from being sexually harassed or objectified by men. So she's pushing back a common narrative among conservative Christian modest bloggers who say, if you dress this certain way, you are protecting yourself from violence from men. You're showing that you are a valuable, worthy woman in the eyes of Christ. By avoiding couching her explanations in religious language, despite being a very popular Christian vlogger, Alethea shows that modesty has a universal appeal and prevents excluding any of her non-Christian viewers who make up a significant portion of her audience base. So Alethea, out of all of the vloggers I looked up, was one of the only ones that did not heavily emphasize how central religion was to their understanding of modesty. You had to really search through her videos and listen to what she was saying to pick up that she was in fact Christian. She came from a conservative background, and that was something that was still significant to her. While most of the vloggers that I examined believe that dressing modestly is a religious requirement that is laid out in religious texts or commentaries, which they actually never directly quote in their videos, they ultimately position modest dress as an individual choice. They recognize the struggles of dressing modestly in a society that often views such sartorial practices as backwards, ugly, and oppressive can be quite difficult for young women and girls. Many explain that they are judged by other women, including their co-religionists, over their dress choices, which makes them question their decisions to begin with. The vloggers often share their struggles with finding modest clothing in mainstream stores that do not need to be altered. The maxi dresses or skirts that they find at fast fashion stores often have high slits, cutouts, or use sheer material. And this is even the case when brands are targeting modest religious women. For instance, in 2018, H&M released a modest fashion collection targeting Muslim shoppers, and the collection launched right before the start of Ramadan. Many of the dresses were mid-calf length and had deep necks, or had sheer sleeves, like you see this one in the middle. And while there's more than one way to dress modestly and to look Muslim, and I'm putting that in air quotes, having these kind of things does kind of make it hard to alter, especially when you have sheer sleeves. You have to put a cardigan over it. And many women just want to find things ready to wear piece. So YouTube is a space for vloggers to help their viewers navigate shopping, share their own clothing hauls from popular brands, and even share what's in their closet. The goal for these vloggers is to look fashionable and religious without appearing to be either sexy or frumpy. The intimate nature of these videos opens up space for conversation between the bloggers and their viewers. And these conversations often happen across religious lines. So on average, women from other religious groups account for about 10 to 15% of the comments left on an individual video that I examine. But their comments usually have the highest level of engagement from the blogger and their audience members, showing that the videos are a space for interfaith dialogue. Typically, viewers begin their comments by stating their own religious identification, something like, I'm a Muslim, but. Most of the comments on videos affirm the viewer's support of dressing modestly and the benefits for dressing modestly, pointing out the commonalities between the religions. So it's very common to have a Christian post on a Muslim or a Jewish woman's videos that I love the way you're dressed, I'm Christian, I'm trying to get into modest wear and you're an inspiration for me. They often applaud the bloggers for being role models for other women interested, and they leave their own tips on how to dress modest and fashionably. For example, on Alethea's video, one user left, quote, "I'm a Muslim and I started at my teenage years to dress more in pants and skirts and long summer dresses. And recently I decided to wear the hijab officially, and it made me feel so comfortable and so in charge of my body." These types of videos are really important to show that even if the religion didn't say so, there are people out there who choose modesty. God bless you all. So this comment has some of the highest rates of engagement. So there's this shared space of understanding how hard it is to dress modestly and wanting to encourage other people to do so. On more confessional videos where the vloggers express their struggles to maintain their modesty, viewers often share their own struggles. So on one of Mayora's videos, she discussed how she, as a new Jewish convert, is coming to an understanding of religious modesty that leaves room for her to express her Korean American identity. She argues that there is no single Jewish uniform, but that some groups like Ashkenazi or Haredi Jews dominate the discussions around what constitutes modesty. And she had a number of viewers reach out to her and say, listen, I know what it's like to be a convert, whether it's Christian or Jewish. There's space for you to be Korean. Here's how I've done it. So YouTube provides a space for modest religious women to build community, interpret religious texts together, and also share tips. But what is becoming clear is that the boundaries between Jewish and Muslim and Christian are becoming like smaller and smaller. It's more about finding someone who you like because of their personality or their style, not necessarily because of their religious beliefs. And you see this trend following on with religious stores. So I looked at 3 online modest fashion stores, Ahita, Rapunzel, and Inherent Co., to show how fashion companies originally marketed towards a specific group have expanded into the modest fashion sphere to attract more female customers. Making this transition from a Muslim or a Jewish fashion brand to a modest fashion brand often means limiting the visual and oral cues that marks a space as religious. So there's a lack of religious terminology. Usually they don't mention religious texts. They're primarily in English, and they provide a diverse range of styles that could be worn by anyone interested in modest dress, regardless of religion. So this is quite different from early YouTube pages where bloggers were very clear, I'm Muslim, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, this is what I do because of my religion. So Ahita is probably one of the most popular modest fashion brands in the world, as the founder, Ahita Zanetti, created the first burkini, which you see right here. So it's basically leggings or straight leg pants. They're worn underneath a tunic that bare minimum covers your butt. So she was inspired to create modest sportswear after watching her niece struggle to participate in sports while wearing her team uniform and just an everyday hijab. Her goal was to help Muslim women maintain their religious modesty while keeping up with mainstream fashion trends and sports culture. While originally imagined for Muslim women and girls, the burkini has quickly become popular among non-Muslims because it was one of the few full body coverage suits that provided protection from harmful UV sun rays by using breathable, lightweight fabric, and is also pretty cute. A lot of burkinis, copycats are in all black. Hers have neon colors with cool graphics. For instance, in 2011, British television cook Nigel Lawson was photographed wearing a burkini knockoff that followed Ahita's design in Australia to protect her skin from the sun. So we see it's becoming popular from people from different religions who are wearing it for a number of reasons. Ahita's profile grew after burkini bans were either proposed or instituted in several European cities. The shift in focus from Muslim to modest fashion is clear on the website. There is no Arabic. You see the name here of the company kind of is like Arabesque language, but there's nothing that actually visually tells you that this is a company created by Muslims for Muslims. The only mention of Islam at all is in the burkini section where the founder describes her motivations. But she notes that the burkini has found an audience beyond Muslim women, including those who dress modestly for health or cultural reasons. And so you see a similar trend with Rapunzel, which sells scarves and scarves accessories like undercaps and pins to hold fabric in place. The About Us section mentions that the company is founded and run by Jewish women, but this is the only time that Judaism is mentioned. Someone familiar with Jewish modest dress practices would recognize that many of the models are wearing tickles, but to the untrained eye, they just look like beautiful scarves that could be worn by anybody. And that is quite intentional on the part of the Rapunzel founder, Andrea Grinberg, who believes head coverings are for everyone. This becomes clear once you scroll through the store. The models are featured in different styles, including galas down here, turbans, and what you could say kind of looks like a shaila hijab. Of course, this could be to show their shoppers that there's no one way to look Jewish. However, I read it as a way to invite non-Jewish women to buy their scarves because they can be worn literally by anyone for any reason. And this was affirmed by the website itself. They have a women's only Rapunzel community, which is open for anyone interested in modest dress, regardless of their religious background or lack of religious belief, to join and discuss what it means to be a modest woman in the 21st century. And you see a similar trend with Inherent Code, which was founded by a husband-wife duo based in Minnesota, Amy and Anthony Morris. Our story explains that the Lord inspired them to create this company, but that's the only mention of religion. From their dress styles and the language used throughout the website, it's clear that they are Christian, but that's just because I'm familiar with Christianity. So you see these religious women where religion is central to their identity, creating these businesses where they're targeting their co-religionists, but are very aware that in order to be profitable, it's important to kind of expand out to the modest fashion industry. But in doing so, this means minimizing religious difference and even your own religious identity. As Banu Gurkarsko and Anna Sakor argue, bringing together veiling and fashion destabilizes the veil. You can say the same thing about denim skirts, long sleeve blouses, and tihos. What's lost when everyone can wear everything? What is lost when everyone can wear everything and nothing has any religious meaning? And so just briefly, I'm going to talk about what actually is lost. So one interesting trend that I have noticed emerging in the past 5 years that likely would be less popular without the internet is the rise of the Christian hijab and the less common Christian tihol and Christian niqab. I did not see the same borrowing practices among Jewish and Muslim women. While Jewish and Muslim women might purchase clothes or accessories from somebody of a different religion or create outfits inspired by another group, they made it their own in terms of naming and style. So I could not find examples of Jewish women saying that they were wearing hijabs or Muslim women wearing tihols. Of course, the hijab and tihol are not inherently religious words. Hijab literally means barrier and can refer to something as spiritual or physical. And in the Quran, hijab is not actually used to describe a head covering, it's kimar. And tihol is a Yiddish word that means small head scarf. So these words have deep religious meaning, but they're not inherently religious words. So debates around who could wear religiously coded headscarves is a common topic in the modest fashion blogosphere. And they showed up on Melanie L. Turk's YouTube page and on the Rapunzel Ladies page, which is part of Andrea Grinberg's company. Both pages noted that women covering their heads is not exclusive to one religion, and it's not always rooted in religion itself. Melanie L. Turk knows that the hijab predates Islam and that Jewish and Christian women covered their heads before Islam was even established. From her perspective, Muslim women are actually borrowing the practice from other women of the book. The Rapunzel's Ladies page encouraged non-Jewish women who are interested in wearing a tihol to make sure that they have the proper motivations for wearing it, whether it's religious or non-religious. But as long as they could explain to someone else why they were wearing it, it wasn't a problem at all. They encouraged women to educate themselves and to wear it respectfully. Neither woman saw women outside of their religion wearing a hijab or tihol as being a form of cultural appropriation. In fact, they encouraged women to try out if they were interested, because dressing modestly, according to them, has a lot of social and personal benefits. And that's all good and great to encourage cultural exchange, but it does end up flattening religious difference and religious meanings behind the practices. And it also ignores the gendered violence that Muslim and Jewish women face for being read as visibly Muslim or Jewish. And I think it's interesting, we can see some Christian culture hegemony where this is a practice done by Christian women where they borrow from other religious traditions instead of trying to develop their own unique dress practices or borrowing from other Christian groups, whether it's the Amish or the Mennonite or Catholics. While Jewish and Muslim bloggers encourage all women to dress modestly if they wanted to, including wearing hair scarves that were often associated with Jewish and Muslim women, like the tehol and the hijab, I found that many viewers were less generous with their co-religionists who had different definitions of modesty. Renée Lewis points out that while many Muslim women welcome non-Muslim women who are interested in wearing hijabs, the same openness is often not extended to Muslim women who do not cover or whose covering practices fall outside of the bounds of normativity. So for instance, a video by Nadir Abdul-Qadir entitled How to Tie a Turban Head Wrap, 10 Different Styles and Giveaway, featured this exchange between two users where a non-Muslim South Asian woman was wondering if it would be possible for her to wear a turban or a headscarf in her workplace, if that would be a form of cultural appropriation and rude. And a user, not Nadir, responded, no, it's completely fine, because first of all, this isn't even a traditional Muslim way of wearing it. So the users marked some hijab styles, the shaila, which like usually covers your head, your ears, and your neck, with traditional, placing Nadir's styles as outside of Islam, which is at odds with Nadir's own understanding of modesty and dress. So I did not find a single instance of a Muslim woman or a Black woman of any religion confirming that it was cultural appropriation for non-Black women to wear scarves like Nadir's. Many women encourage non-Muslims to start covering. As one of the most visible symbols of Islam, the hijab acts as an entry point for learning more about Islam and Muslims. Others emphasize that covering was not limited to Islam or essential to Islam at all, using their religious affiliations, mainly as Jehovah's Witnesses and evangelical Christians, as proof. Still, I argue that it was acceptable for these viewers to have others mimic Nadir's style because what she was wearing was not a real hijab to them, since her neck and ears were showing. Renée Lewis points out that while many Muslims do cover, they do it in very, very distinct ways that allow them to express their ethnic and racial identities. And this came up in several of Nadir's videos where people would ask if it's cultural appropriation for them to wear a hijab the way Nadir had it styled. And the response was always, this is a cultural thing, this is not real hijab. So we see for Nadir in her videos, culture is weaponized to describe a practice that falls outside of the bounds of hegemonic Islam. People ascribe meanings to objects through their discourses. Muslims here are making judgments, value judgments, and creating boundaries of normativity, calling some things a hijab rather than a head wrap. Hijabs are being seen as Islamic, while head wraps are seen as non-Islamic or not real Islam. Here we see Black aesthetics are viewed as un-Islamic, a point that Suad Abdul-Kabir notes in her book, Muslim Cool. So I found this to be common among the bloggers of color that I examined, that they received more negative comments from women about their appearance, including women from their own religion, many of them challenging them, saying that what they were doing was not real tehol, or it was not wearing a proper hijab, or it was not sinut. So with Mehora, someone said, you're not following sinut because you have fake eyelashes on. In the case of Nadira, it was her wearing makeup and showing her neck and having big earrings. For Michelle Carter, who focuses a lot on helping people not be frumpy, people claim that what she was doing was not actually modest. It was involved in just mainstream fashion and trying to be sexy. So we see that racialized religious hierarchies don't disappear online, they just take new forms. So while there's space for interfaith dialogue and respect and sharing and exchange of ideas, it's oftentimes limited to white women who have kind of the more normative definitions of religious modesty, not necessarily women of color. So it's important to note that not all women who wear headscarves or dress modestly do so for religious reasons. Chemotherapy patients often wear scarves to help them navigate hair loss. Some jobs have very conservative dress codes, and other people just dress modestly because it's comfortable. Yet when we're talking about modest fashion, especially in the mainstream, it's important that we understand that Jewish, Muslim, and Christian women have come together to create some of these images and definitions of modesty, and they've been a driving force in the mainstream fashion industry. So they started off on social media, and these closed groups expanded to become interfaith spaces, and many of the most popular have been able to break into the mainstream. And it's been quite lucrative. Modest fashion is $1 billion industry, with Muslims alone spending $44 billion annually on modest clothing. So modest clothing sells. It's a point of unity, but it's also a space where we can see racialized hierarchies taking on new light. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that very enlightening talk. We have numerous questions. I'm going to kind of put together two of them into one. And really, it's kind of a question about pants, but also headscarf in some ways. So one attendee asked, they would like to hear a lot more about how practices for covering hair differ or don't from coverings of the body, particularly pants. So how do kind of modesty fashion bloggers discuss pants? And on top of that, there is a kind of observation that over the past couple of decades, American Muslim women have been covering more often in ways that don't cover the neck. This person is wondering if that's a reflection on a kind of budding interreligious hair wrap culture, or if it's a thing at all. On top of that, I have a kind of observation as well, particularly in terms of the tickle, the ones that you showed, in that, they very much remind me of the tignon, like the kind of Louisiana Afro-Creole hair wraps. And I'm wondering, is that where, this particular style of wrapping comes from? Or did it just come out of nowhere? It just seems, kind of odd in some ways, knowing the Jewish tradition. I would say, that particular type of hair carving either is associated with Blackness or with settlers in Israel. So it's quite odd, this kind of, there is a transnational aspect of certain types of hair wraps. And I'm wondering, if the styles, are derivative of something, or they just kind of pop up in some ways.
Yeah, so pants, that is a really, really big site of contention in the modest fashion sphere. So, and it really does depend on religion and sometimes down to sect. So on Mayora's video, she talks a lot about like pants. For her, pants are fine as long as they're super baggy. Some women who follow Xavier will say no pants are appropriate because they are a men's fashion, or because they reveal parts of your body more so than like a long skirt or a dress does. So it just really depends on the individual person. What I've found is people can always find a way to justify their dress practices one way or the other. It's like, I'll wear pants, but they're super baggy, or I won't wear them in synagogue, I'll wear them out on the streets. I found that for Muslim women, most of them did wear pants, that all of the women I looked at wore pants. The contention was about how tight they were. So, and what was the definition of pants? Did leggings count? So some of them wore what I would consider, they were skinny jeans, but they were as tight as leggings. But you found ways of accommodating that. So wearing a dress over leggings or jeans, or not wearing that in the mosque, but wearing that out in your daily life. And there were a few commenters that pointed out that modesty is not literally about covering your body. It's about how you cover your body and how you comport yourself. So if you are practicing Zunut, you have on skin tight jeans and like a button up blouse, but it's super tight. You can see your full figure, and you have a tihul on and you can see the baby hairs. That's not necessarily more modest than somebody who is wearing a tunic or a long dress that stops right at their kneecap and has their hair out. So it's about your intentions. And a lot of times it was framed on like, well, how were men viewing you? If this was seen as sexy, then that wasn't proper modesty. In terms of covering neck, that is like a common practice among Muslims across the world. It's definitely common among Black women. So what I'm wearing is pretty common for Black Muslim Americans. For me, honestly, it's practical reasons. It's kind of hot to have all that around your neck. But I've seen in a post 9/11 context, a lot of non-Black Muslim women wear like turbans or like scarf buns as a way to keep their hair covered, but not be read as Muslim. So this is like, this gets you the hijab, but it's not like coded as Muslim. And so to me, that means like, what actually is Muslim? Is it just the things that we associate with like Gulf Arab Muslims or South Asians, or is it literally anything that Muslims wear? In terms of the tihuls, so I think part of this is just like two cultures coming up with things in different contexts. But I think the emergence of turbans that you're seeing with Jewish women does kind of reflect like broader, like cross-cultural pollination, not just with Black Americans, but Arabs. When you're online, you're usually following somebody because you like their fashion and you want to learn how to wrap it that way. So some people might have always been interested in these different styles, but they didn't know how to do it before they saw these YouTube tutorials. What I do find interesting though is like the gele on there at the very bottom. I don't think that was done to say, hey, this is a Jewish style. I mean, there are Black Jews, but I think it was more done to say, hey, Black American woman or African woman, you can buy our scarves too. BTW, they're a lot cheaper than her hijab. So Rapunzel was pretty popular because her her scarves are like $8. And if you go to other stores like Ho Hijab, you can spend $100 on a piece of fabric. They're very beautiful fabric, but it's still $100.
Thanks. Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the next question that an attendee asked, which is they're curious about the cost of these specialized modest clothing items. So you started with Target, a popular and affordable brand, but the bloggers seem to be promoting clothing that may be more expensive. So is there a kind of a unification of class between Jews, Muslims, and Christian women, kind of uniting around their class status and ability to purchase these items?
No, so I see a lot of variety. So if we're being honest, like scarves that cost $3 or $4, those may be very affordable, but they're not necessarily ethically made. They're not going to be sourced ethically. The people who are making these scarves are not going to be paid that much money. So if you are buying a scarf, you should expect to spend like $30 or $40. The Ho Hijab ones are more expensive because she has Swarovski crystal, she has lace, she has all of these things. So what you're paying actually is for the quality. I find that when the bloggers start off with their e-stores, they tend to start off with more expensive things because they actually do want to make sure they make a profit, and they do want to make sure they're paying people. But in order to be competitive with all of these like mainstream brands, they do have to drop their prices, because 10 years ago, you had to go to like Ho Hijab or Rapunzel to find scarves. But now you can go to H&M and Banana Republic and Target and get these, and they're long enough where they actually will allow you to completely cover up. So I think it's good to have the competition, but what ends up happening is prices get lowered, ethical sourcing standards go down, and the people actually making these clothes aren't getting paid enough money. But you can say the same thing with mainstream fashion stores. So like Gap and H&M, most of their clothes are made by poor and working class women of color in the global South, Bangladesh being one of the most popular places in Vietnam. And those are in horrible working conditions. So I don't think there's ever a truly ethical way to consume it, but there are some brands that are more committed to that. So the Blue Tin Company out in Chicago, everything is made by women in the United States, primarily refugee women. They're paid a fair wage. Shuker is another company that is all about ethical sourcing and ethical pay, but you're going to spend $150 on one abaya. So the ability to shop ethically, I mean, it's a class thing. Like this dress I'm wearing here was $60. I could have gotten a Chinese knockoff for $20 and had 3 of them. So being able to do this it's kind of a class marker.
A really great point. Thank you. There's another question I'm going to add to it a little bit. So how much you relate to the individualistic approach, encouraging women to make their own choices and decisions. And what I want to add to that is something that I kept thinking, this kind of specter of men within these comments in particular. So I've seen some of these videos either on TikTok or YouTube, particularly for Muslim women. And there's this like policing by women and then occasionally policing by men, you know, things like, yo, you know, I don't think, you know, I can see one of your hairs or something, you know, hey, sister, that kind of thing, where they're critiquing what they're doing. And I'm wondering, you know, is there some kind of liberatory aspect when women are policing other women about what they're wearing in that sense?
I don't think policing is ever liberatory. And honestly, they're usually using the language of patriarchy to police people. So it's not being like, hey, sister, don't buy that Fashion Nova stuff because like it is bad for the environment. So examples like Mayora and her Zenut video was talking about seeing a teenage girl wearing tight pants and like a low cut shirt going into the synagogue. And she was like, you know, I'm totally heterosexual, but I saw that. I'm a 33-year-old woman and I thought that looked sexy. You know, if I'm a 33-year-old straight woman thinking this like young woman looks sexy, what does like a cis het man think? So usually the critiques, there's not anything different than what men are doing. So that's what I find interesting about Alethea Award is that she kind of rejects all that. So it's not focused on the male gaze. It's like, you do this for your own personal reasons. I think the focus on individual choice is a very American thing. And it's just a reflection of like post-feminist sensibilities where like we're all our own, we're responsible for our own choices. But I also think it's a really, really important rhetorical strategy where they're not trying to compete or challenge with what male authorities are saying or what the religious texts are saying. It's like, yes, this, I believe it's required, but at the end of the day, you have to deal with the consequences of dressing this way or that way. So I think it also reflects it is really hard to do this. We live in like a sex-crazed society. We also live in a society where it's really hard to find these clothes. You're either going to have to use fast fashion or you're going to have to like spend hundreds of dollars to get something ethically made. If you're buying stuff online, there's no guarantee it's going to fit. There's all of these multiple problems with it. So I think for them, it's a recognition. It is hard. It's a fluid position. So you might be super modest one day and change your definition of modesty the next day. So it's leaving some wiggle room for them and for their viewers to make up their own minds.
Yeah, I'm also curious about kind of these contributions that these fashion bloggers are making, particularly in terms of this transition from understanding modesty as frumpiness to modesty as beauty in a way. How would you frame that? Is it like something that is part of a more kind of American commodification of the body through clothes, or is it a religious framing, or is there something else that I'm missing there?
I think it's a religious framing. And if you listen to them, they're viewing beauty as an act of worship of God. So there are hadiths you can mention where Allah is beautiful and he loves beauty. Some of the Jewish women I'm studying being like, you know, when you go to synagogue, you want to stand before the Most High, like in your best. You never know when evangelicals often say, well, you never know when you're going to die. So if you die in like a bikini strap, like super tight dress, is that how you want to meet Jesus? So they see it for them as you want to always look your best, but you also want to attract young women to want to dress modestly. If you see being modestly as Handmaid's Tales or Big Love, that's going to push people away from the religion and into mainstream fashion. So I think it's a mix of like worship, but also like the recognition that there's competition.
That's a really great point. There's one more question here concerning this person is wondering if you interact at all with Susanna Drake's work, Unveiling, in Christian, Jewish, and Muslim circles.
No, but I wrote her name down, so I will have to. Thank you so much.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? And maybe I'll leave room for the next 10 minutes for our other panelists and Rebecca to, if they have questions, if they want to kind of think through together. I think one aspect, you know, to kind of tie everything together, and maybe Rebecca and Richard, you could, you know, unmute your videos. Wonderful, yes. Okay, we got one there and two, perfect. You know, one kind of amazing thing that is tied together is that there is some racialization in these sartorial choices, right? In terms of like who can wear what and who feels comfortable wearing that. I was really struck by the kind of Christian, conservative Christian performance of their, you know, sartorial choices. And that, you know, you said, oh, well, it doesn't strike me, you know, they're not saying, you know, they just use the word the Lord, they're not saying anything Christian. But from the image, it was like, oh yeah, they're clearly Christian, right? And I guess it's because they're white. I'm not sure, right? And there's no one else. And so that kind of association that goes with that, that is part of kind of a myth of what we conceptualize as like, you know, this, you know, covering your hair is something that Arabs do, and Arab Muslims in particular. But that's completely separate from how Black, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim women would also cover their hair, right? So kind of that like deconstructing those boundaries in both of your cases, in both of your talks, but also kind of like putting together how that is. So that's kind of my short comments on that. I'll leave it open to the rest of you.
Yeah, so I think there is some deconstruction of boundaries, but they're also creating new boundaries with doing this. So they're still marking something as modest, something as Islamic, and it's around race lines. They're still selling things that aren't affordable to everybody. So this is like more middle class thing to have access to the internet in the first place, to be able to have time to watch these videos, to learn these different styles. So they're new boundaries, they might be expanded, but it's still not freeing up everybody to do whatever they want.
That's a good point. I mean, yeah, also, well, you know, even taking online stores out of it, you know, if you go to some of these stores that are either marked specifically for Muslim men and women or for Jewish men and women, they're gonna be expensive. Right, so it's like kind of like a pay to play aspect of like sartorial choices for religious beings and humans. It's quite odd if you think about it. I really like that you're bringing that out there.
So I had a question for Richard. How do we get the Academy to finally catch up with what Black people are doing on the ground? Because there seems to be like this disconnect. Like, I didn't read Charles Long in my methods and theory class. I read him in my African American religious history class that was an elective. So I'm having these conversations with like a small group of people, but like just generally just religious studies scholars probably didn't even know who he was until he died.
Yeah, I think the until he died, it's like, oh, I should have paid attention to him.
Mhm.
He was important. He has an obituary. Like, I mean, like there's a lot of that. I think there's I'm very suspicious of the like favorites, like who are our favorite Black scholars I can put on my list to show that I'm down. Like, I really like even this sort of diversify your syllabus, like checklist and things. I'm like, I respect anyone who's doing that kind of work, but I'm also aware that if you have to do a checklist, that we are a lot further behind than we may be ready to accept. And my take is, I'm wondering if we are at a point, maybe it's naivete, where we can just stop like pretending like a lot of these Black scholars and folks on the ground haven't done this work already. And that we just say like, we've read y'all stuff, y'all haven't read our stuff. And like, we know your stuff better than you think you know your stuff. And I think there's I don't know. I haven't given up, but I am amazed whenever I find someone has Columbused something that's been around for 20 or 30 years, you know, like, so yeah, I find myself often in that position of like, translating is the wrong word, but introducing someone to something that has been around for a long time. And by someone, I mean white people, the white academy, you know, in biblical studies or white method and theory people. So yeah, I don't know. I wish I did. Do you have thoughts on that? I'm so curious. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think part of the problem is these people, most of the people who are doing the checklist are white people. We have to, so much of what Black scholars study isn't even legible to other religious studies scholars. So like, I don't teach in critical ethnic and race studies by choice. I couldn't get a job in Islamic studies or religious studies. So my work was recognized and seen by people studying Black people, but not by people studying religious practices. So I've had to take language that's very rooted in like this certain tradition and kind of translate it to ethnic studies or Black studies, where like my only background is I took a whole bunch of Black religious studies classes. Doesn't make it Black studies or ethnic studies, but that's how it's coded.
Right. Yeah. And I think that about how it's coded to me is like that's so real. Like, I mean, I'm very, you know, when I hear about all these departments hiring Black people right now, or they're looking to hire people who do a certain kind of work in around Black religion. We'll just use Black religion for now. And there's usually strings attached at the institutional level of they want Black people who do it. You know, can't say that, but that's what they want. But you know, what are they going to do when those people get there? What are they going to do to support those people? What kind of work are those scholars going to be allowed to do such that they meet whatever diversity requirements are in gen ed or whatever? You know, I sometimes tell graduate students the story of when I, at my first job at Elizabethtown College, okay, saying this now, provost, when I got hired there for a call for someone who did African American religions, could teach an intro to Islam class and anything else they could do. When I got hired for that job, my job offer letter said assistant professor of African American religions. It's like no one else has that kind of designation in that department. And I wrote the provost back like precisely that. Like the only time that you saw that was with a full professor. And I was like, unless you're about to move me up to that, maybe we need to just change this to, you know, professor of religion. And I was fortunate that I got to be able to teach things starting with Black people. That's sort of that was my approach to doing a lot of stuff there. And that worked out pretty well in a lot of ways. But I'm very concerned for, you know, the job market and these scholars who are like, oh yeah, there's all these positions and opportunities. And I'm like, read that fine print. And what's going to be accepted from hire to tenure and on. I think we can present scholarship on our terms, and they will have to catch up.
Yeah, agreed. I am wondering though, like, because I will say like both of your work is very legible to me, even though I'm not in religious studies by any means. And so I'm wondering what is that space there? Like, how do we make sense of that? That people in your fields may not find your work legible, but someone that's familiar or knowledgeable about Blackness in general can easily kind of, engage with it.
Well, I think for me, part of it, and at least Marissa first talks about this with Islamic studies, most Islamic studies drop posts aren't actually written by Islamists. They're written by like old Christian white dudes who are like, well, Arabs over there, that's Arab religion, study that. So if you look at job posts, it's somebody who does classical Islam, can speak Arabic and Persian and all of these other things, which it's important. Like if you're studying Islam, yes, you should be able to interact with the Quran. But if I come in rolling in talking about Nation of Islam fashion, they don't know what to do that. They don't, that's Black political stuff over there. Where's the religion? So it has to do with like who is in charge of these institutions. But also I think academia has this really terrible trend of trying to keep up with current events. So now it's real big. You're seeing all of these Black studies jobs because Black Lives Matter. But they're not being written by people who are actually familiar with the field. Like, I'm happy I have this job, but no one who has a PhD in Black studies or ethnic studies would have ever given me this position. But it's just, I'm a Black person who studies Black things and Black people. So that must be Black studies.
It's a really great point.
Yeah, the sense that you'll become the exemplar in one setting when it would just be a completely different conversation in another, like I taught in a gender or ethnic, I guess it was ethnic and women's studies department when I was in my doctoral program. And it's just like a different world, like, in terms of how I measured up on their rubrics of what I did versus what, in religious studies, they're like, oh, you're Black, you know these things, you can speak to these things. It's just, I don't think that the people on committees, departments, HR departments are aware of not only what they're asking for, but the burden they're putting on students. Like I went at my previous job, one thing I recognized in that class that called Signifying Religion, it was a religion 101. And I was like, we're going to start this with Black people. That's how this is going to be. But that class also became the outlet through which students were processing all their current events, and Black Lives Matter and all these things. And I was looking at my teaching reports when I was going up for a fourth year review. And what I saw was that students were like, this was a really useful class, but this was a really hard class. And like, it just became clear that they were drained being human and working through that in the confines of my class. And I was like, that's not what they don't come to my class to be able to change the world. But that's the burden that I think is sometimes perceived as, well, we have Black people, they're going to solve our problems. They're going to solve our race problem. They're going to be, our Negro solution. And that's
Yeah,
it's not going to work. Yeah.
My position is actually part of a form of reparations for the founder being a slaveholder. I did not know that when I applied for the job. So,
wow. That is something I see that people are kind of trickling out. So I'll leave it to Rebecca to kind of conclude there. And
I'll just say, I mean, now there's only 17 people left, so I can be really honest. You know how usually it's like you commission talks and they're great, but they're like not you expected. This is like the first time this has been everything that I hoped it would be, both of them. That was just, and Bryan, you were much better at talking about women's clothing than I was expecting. So this whole thing has just been like really, really affirming. And for those of you who are still here, don't forget to come back a month from now for Dr. Patel talking about magic and its malcontents. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
thank you.